respected journalist sits in a courtroom watching as a police officer fabricates a story that could send her to prison. The jury seems to believe him, until an unexpected revelation changes everything. What happens when the truth threatens to unravel a system built on lies? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Alyssa Carter sat rigidly in her chair, her fingers clenched together beneath the wooden defense table. She willed herself not to react as Officer Brandon Tate recounted his version of the story. His voice was steady, dripping with authority, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent courtroom lights. "I had no choice but to defend myself," Tate declared, turning his gaze toward the jury with calculated remorse. "Ms. Carter struck me first. I was simply doing my job." Alyssa's lawyer, David Lawson, let out a slow, controlled breath. He had warned her this would happen. The courtroom always gave more weight to a police officer's word than the accused, especially when the accused was a black woman calling out corruption. Judge Marion Holloway, an older white woman with an unreadable expression, peered over her glasses at the witness stand. "Continue, Officer Tate." Tate nodded. It was a chaotic scene. Protesters were everywhere. I approached Ms. Carter to disperse the crowd peacefully, but she became aggressive. She pushed me and tried to grab my baton. I had to subdue her. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Alyssa's nails dug into her palm. It was a lie, all of it, but the jury was eating it up. Her actual experience that day had been vastly different. She had been covering a peaceful demonstration against police brutality, camera in hand, when Tate had shoved her to the ground without warning. He had pressed his knee into her back, confiscated her phone, and later charged her with assault. And now he was twisting reality to protect himself. Her friend Tasha Reynolds sat just behind her in the gallery, gripping the armrests of her chair so tightly her knuckles were white. She knew the truth, too, but the truth didn't always matter in a courtroom like this. David stood, buttoning his suit jacket with practiced calm. "Officer Tate, let me clarify. Ms. Carter, an unarmed journalist, was the aggressor against you, an armed officer?" Tate leaned back slightly, as if insulted. "Correct." David nodded as if considering this. "And yet, multiple witnesses say otherwise." Tate shrugged. "Witnesses can be mistaken. Things happen fast in protests." David tapped his pen against the table. "You claim there was no footage of the incident?" Tate didn't hesitate. "That's correct. To my knowledge, no video exists." Alyssa bit her tongue. The footage did exist. She knew it did. But the problem was, her phone had been wiped clean by the time she got it back. Judge Holloway turned to David. "Do you have further questions for the witness?" David exchanged a glance with Alyssa before shaking his head. "Not at this time, Your Honor." Holloway nodded and turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will take a brief recess before continuing." She banged the gavel, signaling the break. As soon as they were dismissed, Alyssa exhaled sharply, her heart racing. "He's too comfortable," David muttered as he sat beside her. "He's done this before." "I know," Alyssa whispered, "but what if we can't prove it?" Tash leaned forward, whispering urgently, "We might be able to." Alyssa turned to her friend, confused. "What do you mean?" Tasha's eyes flickered with something intense. Determination, maybe even hope. "I just got a message. Someone found a video." 30 minutes later, Alyssa was back in her seat. But now she felt something different, a spark of hope. David stood before the court as the trial resumed. "Your Honor, we have new evidence that contradicts Officer Tate's testimony." The room shifted with sudden energy. The prosecutor, Jacob Mills, shot up from his chair. "Objection! This evidence was not submitted before trial." David kept his voice steady. "It was just uncovered. Your Honor, this video proves that Officer Tate's entire testimony is a lie." Judge Holloway pursed her lips. "I want to see it." Tasha handed David her tablet, and he connected it to the courtroom's large screen. The video, taken from a bystander's phone, was clear as day. Officer Tate approaching Alyssa unprovoked, grabbing her wrist, shoving her to the ground, and pinning her there with unnecessary force. At no point did she attack him. Gasps erupted throughout the courtroom. Alyssa barely breathed as she watched. She had known the truth, but seeing it laid out for everyone, seeing how easily he had lied, made her blood run cold. The color drained from Tate's face. That footage is taken out of context," he stammered. David turned to him with a slow, calculated nod. "Out of context? Officer Tate, do you deny that this is you in the video?" Tate's jaw tightened. No, but David let the silence hang for a beat before continuing. "Then tell me, Officer Tate, how do you explain this?" He pointed at the screen, where Tate was shown pushing Alyssa down, without provocation. The prosecutor tried to recover. "Your Honor, this is highly unorthodox." Judge Holloway held up a hand. "Save it, Mr. Mills." She turned to Tate. "Officer, do you have an explanation?" Tate swallowed hard. I don't recall it happening that way." David pounced. "So you're saying your memory of the incident is faulty?" I mean, Tate stuttered. The courtroom was silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Then Judge Holloway leaned forward. "Officer Tate, I strongly advise you to choose your next words carefully." A long pause, then finally, "I may have misremembered some details." David smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "Misremembered, right?" Another murmur swept through the room. The jury's faces had shifted. What had once been trust in Tate had turned into something else. Doubt. The damage was done. As court adjourned for the day, Alyssa felt the shift in power. She had been on the verge of being crushed by a system designed to silence her. But now Tate was the one scrambling. Tasha clutched her arm. "That was huge. He cracked." David exhaled. "And tomorrow, we push harder." Alyssa finally allowed herself to breathe. For the first time in weeks, she believed she had a chance. But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, Officer Tate walked into the courtroom with a rigid back and clenched jaw. But Alyssa could see it now. The barely concealed panic behind his eyes. His hands fidgeted as he adjusted his uniform. He had spent years wearing that badge like a shield, but today it felt like a target. Alyssa sat beside David, her heart pounding. Today was the day they had to break him. Judge Holloway entered, her presence commanding as she called the court back into session. "Mr. Lawson, you may proceed with your cross-examination." David stood, his expression calm and methodical. "Officer Tate, let's go back to your testimony from yesterday." Tate shifted in his seat. "Yes, sir. You stated that Ms. Carter assaulted you and that no video evidence existed. But we now have clear footage that contradicts that claim." David paced slowly. "So tell me, officer, were you lying then, or are you lying now?" A hushed murmur spread through the room. The prosecutor, Jacob Mills, sat stiffly, his mouth pressed into a tight line. He had been blindsided yesterday, and now his star witness was unraveling before his eyes. Tate swallowed. I made a mistake. It was a chaotic situation. I misinterpreted the events in the moment." David didn't let him off that easily. "Misinterpreted? You tackled an unarmed woman to the ground, kept your knee on her back, and filed a police report stating she attacked you first. That's not a misinterpretation, Officer Tate. That's perjury." Tate's mouth opened, but no words came. He was drowning. David pressed on. "Tell me, officer, was this really just an isolated mistake, or have you done this before?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Tate's eyes darted toward the prosecution table, seeking an out, but Mills wasn't looking at him. The prosecutor knew Tate wasn't worth saving anymore. Tate hesitated. "I follow procedures." David smirked. "Is that right? Because I have another witness who seems to believe otherwise." A sharp gasp rippled through the courtroom as the doors opened, and in walked Officer Miguel Ramirez, a cop in uniform but not one sitting in the defendant's seat. He took his place on the witness stand. Judge Holloway adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Lawson, care to explain?" David turned back to the jury. "Your Honor, Officer Ramirez has come forward with damning information regarding not just Officer Tate, but a pattern of false reports and cover-ups within the department." Tate's face drained of color. Alyssa felt her pulse race. She knew something big was coming, but this was beyond what she had hoped for. David approached the new witness. "Officer Ramirez, you've worked in the department for how many years?" 10. Ramirez responded, his voice steady. David nodded. "And during those years, have you ever witnessed misconduct from Officer Tate?" Ramirez shifted. "Yes." Gasps rang out. Tate shook his head furiously, his leg bouncing under the table. "This is ridiculous." Judge Holloway banged her gavel. "Quiet, Officer Tate. You'll have your chance." David gestured toward Ramirez. "Please continue." Ramirez cleared his throat. "There have been incidents, several. Excessive force reports that were either ignored or rewritten, false accusations against civilians, especially against black and brown individuals. I should have spoken up sooner." Tasha let out a sharp breath behind Alyssa. This was bigger than a single case. David pressed. "And you have proof of this?" Ramirez's nod was slow but firm. "I do. I have copies of altered reports, cases where Officer Tate and other officers fabricated charges against innocent people." The courtroom erupted. Judge Holloway slammed the gavel again, demanding silence. Tate looked like a cornered animal, eyes darting wildly. He turned to Mills, but the prosecutor refused to make eye contact. David let the silence stretch before delivering his final blow. "Officer Ramirez, why are you coming forward now?" Ramirez's jaw clenched. "Because I was tired of watching innocent people get thrown in jail while men like Tate walked free." Something snapped in Tate. His chair screeched against the floor as he shot to his feet. "This is a goddamned witch hunt," he bellowed. "You're all out to get me." Mills groaned, rubbing his temples. "Sit down." But Tate was spiraling. His desperation had cracked wide open. "This is what happens when you side with criminals." His eyes shot toward Alyssa. "You think you won? You're nothing but a troublemaker. If people like you just shut up, none of this would be happening." The courtroom froze. Alyssa refused to look away. She had faced men like him before, men who thought their authority made them untouchable. But right now, Tate was losing. Judge Holloway's face twisted in anger. "Enough." Her voice was sharp and final. "Officer Tate, you are now under investigation for perjury and falsifying police reports. Mr. Mills, I expect the district attorney's office to take swift action." Mills let out a slow, resigned sigh. "Yes, Your Honor," Tate sputtered, looking around wildly. You can't do this. I was just doing my job." Judge Holloway leaned forward, her voice cold. "And now, you'll answer for it." Two officers approached Tate, placing handcuffs around his wrists. And just like that, his reign was over. The trial wasn't over yet, but Alyssa could already feel it. The tides had turned. As the courtroom emptied, Tasha grabbed Alyssa's arm. "Do you realize what just happened?" Her voice was filled with barely restrained exhilaration. "That wasn't just about you, Alyssa. That was about all of us." David joined them, running a hand over his face. "Tate's done. And with Ramirez's testimony, this is going to explode beyond this courtroom. The department can't cover it up anymore." Alyssa swallowed. "We're making history." David nodded. "Yeah, but the fight isn't over yet." She knew he was right. Exposing one officer was just the beginning. The entire system needed to be held accountable. Alyssa squared her shoulders. "Then let's make sure the whole world knows the truth." She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every voice that had been silenced before her. The courtroom may have erupted when the truth came out, but the fight was far from over. Corruption ran deep, and the people who had spent years protecting Officer Tate weren't going to let this slide. Alyssa Carter had won a battle, but could she win the war? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Alyssa sat at the defense table, heart pounding as the gavel cracked against the judge's bench. "Order," Judge Holloway commanded, glaring at the still-stirring courtroom. "We are in a court of law, not a circus." Officer Brandon Tate stood frozen, his wrists locked in handcuffs, his face a portrait of panic and rage. He had lied under oath, he had falsified reports, and now the world knew. But this wasn't the end. Alyssa knew that exposing Tate was just the first domino to fall. The entire system, the officers, the prosecutors, the department higher-ups who had covered for him, they were all scrambling now. Her lawyer, David Lawson, stood confidently. "Your Honor, given the overwhelming evidence presented today, we request that all charges against Ms. Carter be dismissed immediately." Jacob Mills, the prosecutor, looked like a man drowning. He knew he had lost, but he didn't want to admit it. "Your Honor," Mills began hesitantly, "this case has taken unexpected turns, but I'd like to request a short recess before any final decisions are made." David scoffed. "A recess? You mean time for the prosecution to figure out how to salvage what's left of their case?" Judge Holloway's expression darkened. "Mr. Mills, given the fact that the state's primary witness, Officer Tate, has been caught in multiple lies, I don't see any further need for delays. The truth has been made abundantly clear." Mills's lips thinned. He had no more cards to play. "Very well," he muttered. The judge turned toward Alyssa, and for the first time in this trial, her expression softened slightly. "Miss Carter, you were falsely accused. You endured a wrongful arrest, public humiliation, and the weight of a justice system that failed to protect you. But today, you stand vindicated." Alyssa held her breath. Judge Holloway took a deep breath before delivering the words that changed everything. "All charges against Ms. Carter are hereby dismissed." The sound of the gavel striking the bench echoed like a gunshot of victory. Alyssa closed her eyes, relief washing over her in waves. It was over. Or at least, this part of it was. As soon as court adjourned, Tasha grabbed Alyssa in a crushing hug. "You did it," she whispered fiercely. "No," Alyssa breathed, glancing around the courtroom. "We exposed it. That's not the same thing." David joined them, his expression thoughtful. "She's right. Tate's going down, but he wasn't working alone." Tasha's excitement dimmed slightly. "You think they'll try to sweep this under the rug?" David nodded grimly. "They always do." And sure enough, the backlash was immediate. Within hours, the police union released a statement defending Tate, claiming he had been a victim of political persecution. The department launched an internal investigation, which Alyssa knew was code for trying to bury the rest of the corruption before it reached the public. The headlines were everywhere. Exposed. Officer. Lied under oath. What else are journalists targeted by police cleared of all charges? Department scrambles to contain fallout after officers' lies revealed. But there was one headline that made Alyssa's blood turn cold. Protesters clash with police after explosive trial verdict. It had started almost immediately. The night of her acquittal, hundreds of people gathered outside the courthouse, demanding a full investigation into the police department. Then the police showed up in riot gear. Tasha threw her phone onto the table in Alyssa's apartment. "Look at this," she fumed. "They're treating people like criminals just for wanting justice." Alyssa scrolled through the videos. Protesters being shoved, people being dragged away in handcuffs, tear gas billowing into the air. David sighed heavily. "They want to scare people into silence." Alyssa stared at the screen, her fists clenching. "Then we make sure they can't ignore this." The next morning, Alyssa sat in front of a camera, ready to do what she did best: expose the truth. Her live stream went live to hundreds of thousands of viewers. "This is Alyssa Carter," she said, her voice steady but fierce. "And if you think this fight is over, think again." She recounted everything: the trial, the video evidence, the false police reports, and now, the police's attempt to silence protesters. "This isn't just about me," she continued. "How many other people have been falsely accused, locked away, or worse, without the evidence to prove their innocence?" The comments fluttered in. "We stand with you. How do we help? Expose them all." Tasha sat beside her, her laptop open. "It's blowing up, Alyssa. People are watching." "Good. Because the police weren't the only ones who could control the narrative. In the following weeks, the fallout only grew. More whistleblowers came forward, exposing years of fabricated police reports and wrongful arrests. The mayor ordered an independent investigation into the police department, putting several high-ranking officials under scrutiny. Alyssa's story became a national movement, igniting debates about police accountability and the desperate need for reform. And then the final blow came. Officer Brandon Tate, in a last-ditch effort to save himself, agreed to a plea deal. He would testify against the very system that had once protected him. The irony was almost poetic. A month later, Alyssa walked past the courthouse again, this time as a free woman. Tasha nudged her. "You ever think about what's next?" Alyssa smiled faintly. "Yeah, I do." She pulled out her phone, staring at a new tip that had just come in. One about another wrongful conviction, another lie buried beneath the system. "This wasn't the first time," she murmured, "and it won't be the last." Tasha sighed. "So, what are we going to do?" Alyssa's grip tightened around her phone. "We expose them, one by one." And with that, the fight continued.